Right. Well, officially welcome everybody to session 2 of the We the People Competition Bootcamp. We are super excited that you're able to join us today, and we have a lot of great material to cover. And we're looking forward to answering many of your questions and having this be very interactive as well. So we're a good sized group, so we can make this as discussion oriented as we would like. So we're looking forward to having a good chat with y'all today. As we do have some new people joining us for the first time, I'm going to ask our amazing and wonderful mentors, facilitators to introduce themselves to the group. Ashley, why don't you kick us off?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashley Vasick. I live in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, but I've been teaching. I start on Monday, year 15 in Western Maryland. I've been involved with We the People since 2010, and my students are currently the last year was the 8th consecutive state championship. So I'm pretty versed in prepping students for the national competition and just being involved in this program and all it has to offer. And whether you do it competitively or just do it in your classroom or you just teach the stuff that's in the curriculum, this program is essential for all students and honestly adults too. So I hope you feel that way as you've kind of explored the curriculum a little bit. And I look forward to working with you guys today.
Thanks, Ashley. Megan.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Boyman-Hennies. I teach at Highlands High School in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which is in the very northern tip of the state, just south of Cincinnati, Ohio. Like Ashley, I have a lot of competition experience. My team has been the Kentucky State champions for the past at least 15 years in a row, and have been relatively successful at nationals. Our Unit 5 from our nationals team this past year won the Unit 5 award. So I have a lot of different experiences bringing students in, and I'm super excited that you're all here. And I just want to reiterate what Ashley said, like, whether you do the competition element or not, or just integrate it into your classroom, it's just the most transformative program for students. And I'm really excited to help you start or continue your journey.
Thanks, Megan. And my name is Emily Voss. I work for the Center for Civic Education. So we produce your We the People materials. My specific role is the Senior Director of National Programs and Professional Development. And prior to joining the center staff, I was the Virginia State Coordinator for We the People for just about 10 years. So I've done teacher training programs in Virginia and then also run multiple levels of competition in the state of Virginia. So between the three of us, we've got quite a lot to share and are real excited to have you join us. All right, so since we do have a good number of folks who are new, we'll just recap a little bit of what we covered in session 1. And if you did happen to miss session 1 and you'd like to watch a recording, the link is posted there on your screen, so you can just capture that and watch it later. That session ran for about 75 minutes, so if you want to watch it later, you're certainly welcome to do so. But things that we covered in the first session, we covered the why. So many of you have used We the People to some degree in your classroom prior to today, but some of you have done this or are just becoming familiar with We the People for the first time. So we talked about why you should do the simulated congressional hearing that is the culminating project of We the People. So you're welcome to use the lessons as much or as little as you want, but why should you do the simulated congressional hearing? So we talked about that. There's a bunch of benefits. The kids actually do love it. They seem scared of it at first, but they do love it. We also talked through the types of competition, and this can start at just an in-school or in-class event where you organize yourself to bring in volunteer judges, and then the students will just present within your own classroom. That's kind of the entry level. But we also then talked through how you might do a whole school competition, or you might participate in an organized competition, which would be potentially at a regional level or a state level, depending on which state you live in. So we'll go over how you organize an in-school event in session 3, but just to let you know, we did cover that. We also covered some frequently asked questions for organized competitions, which we're certainly happy to revisit today if you all have additional questions about that. And then content-wise, we talked about some core knowledge and key skills that students gain as part of their We the People experience. So, we talked a lot about things that the students will ultimately be able to understand, not things that they need to walk in your classroom knowing. So this We the People is really a growth process, and the students are not ever expected to be experts on anything that they walk into your classroom. We also then chatted about interdisciplinary opportunities for We the People. So because government is going to cover lots and lots of different categories, there are other avenues for you to create partnerships with other teachers in your school division, depending on how much you would like to do that. So there's opportunities to work with ELA teachers, opportunities to potentially work with science teachers. We talked through that as well. So again, if you missed it, you can grab the link and you can catch up on that later on. So what we're going to cover today in session 2, we're going to get more into nuts and bolts. Session 1 was a bit more high level, but today we're going to get into some real nuts and bolts planning. We are going to talk through effective team and study strategies. So how do you think about which kid belongs on which panel, different strategies for your calendar to make sure that the students have enough time to work through building their hearing prep. We're going to talk about how you can enhance their learning experience. So opportunities to tie in other curricula, particularly the AP Gov curriculum. We're going to cover that. We're going to talk about engaging experts and resources. So it doesn't just have to be you that works with the students on We the People. There is a whole universe of people out there who are eager and willing to work with you and your students that can really engage the students even more. And then lastly, we will talk about how to optimize practice and feedback. So over the course of the process where students are preparing and practicing, how do we keep building on that to help students improve as they go? So those are the main topics for today, and we look forward to answering lots of your questions. So how this will work agenda-wise today. We have thought of this we have a synchronous session, 2 synchronous sessions, and an asynchronous session. So from 11 to 12:15 Eastern, this will be, synchronous session. We're all just going to chat amongst ourselves, do some presentations for you. And then once we get to about 12:15, we will go into asynchronous time. We'll explain what we'd like you to do during that period, but Ashley and Megan and I will stay online if you want to talk through specifics. If you just want to chat further, that will be an asynchronous thing. So feel free to get yourself off Zoom and take a walk or whatever you need to do during that time, but we'll be here for that. And we'll once again join back together at 1:30 Eastern to talk about the experts and resources and practice and feedback. So all together, not together, all together. All right, and to remind folks for engaging with us today, there's multiple ways you can do that. You can chat us a question at any time, whether it's Ashley or me or Megan, we'll happily answer your questions in the chat. Or if you want to raise your hand, and we're happy to call on you and you can ask your question out loud. So we are eager to answer any of your questions, however you want to ask them. All right. So with that, we will go ahead then and kick off with our first subject matter of the day, which is team and study strategies. All right. So Ashley and Megan, please take it away.
Okay. So I think one of the most daunting things for me when I was a first teacher was figuring out how am I going to organize students together into units for the competition format where I could get a good mix of all of the skills that are needed to participate in a simulated congressional hearing, but also so that the personalities mesh in a way where they aren't like fighting with each other. And what I can say is my first year, it was kind of rough. I had students um, screaming at each other in a group, and I didn't know that they were cousins that had a really, kind of like hostile relationship. So that would have been good for me to know. So going from that learning experience, one of the things that I try to do, especially within like the first quarter of my school year, so like August and September, is have students work in small groups, both with the people that they choose, but also me randomly assorting them just to get a sense of like their personalities, who works best with who, and how they contribute. When it comes time to putting them in the competition units, what we always have to consider is the fact that they're in the high school curriculum, there are 6 like units of study, and so each unit needs to represent one of those 6. So what I do is right before we go into the formal like competition preparation component, I have my students fill out a pretty detailed Google Form survey where they rank their what they perceive to be their strengths and weaknesses. So I'm looking at that from a sense of skills like argumentative writing, organization, research, playing well with others, time management, knowledge of US history, and also knowledge of current events. And it doesn't mean that they have to be perfect at it, but it's interesting to see where students rank themselves in it. And they're fairly honest because they know it's only me looking at it. And then I also have them tell me a little bit about themselves. I ask them to rank the order or the units in order that they're most interested. And then also I try to ask them 2 final questions, asking them to identify 1 or 2 people they would really like to work with. And then finally, I allow them, because it is anonymous and I only see it, to identify 1 to 2 people in the class that they know they absolutely cannot work with. So I don't need to know the reason why. I don't want to know the reason why. But if it's, and I always tell them to think about it from a perspective of, is there someone in here that if you were placed in a long-term unit together, would it be a detriment to you as a person, to them, to your small unit, or the team as a whole? And so my first guarantee for my students is that as I'm creating the final units, I actually start with a who can they not work with, and then work backwards from there. Because if nothing else, they're going to be working in these same small units, at least in my class, from like October through May. And I want them to be with people they feel confident with and people that they know aren't going to cause them any more stress and anxiety. So, and then I beautiful mind it, as I tell everyone. I put all their information from the Google form on note cards, and then I literally like put them up on my board or on a table, and I start rearranging it until I get a mix of those skills, those interests, who they want to work with, who they can't work with, to make sure that all of my researchers aren't in one unit, all of my people who are terrified of public speaking in another. And then once they're in their units, that's final for me. Basically, then at that point, we go through ways to self-regulate, to kind of we actually go through conflict resolution, training a little bit in my class to deal with that as well in a small group, and then talk about how I can intervene to help manage any like ongoing issues that they have. I will, in session 3, when we share a lot of those resources, have a copy of that form if you're interested in looking at it that students fill out, as well as some like pictures of how I organize things, just so you can get a sense of what to do it. One of the things I will say is don't feel rushed to put them in units right away. Like let them mix and match. And also give yourself time to make those units. If you're going to be the one to do that, give yourself a week or two to like sit down, look at it, step back, come back to it, and make sure that you are confident with it as well. So that if there are any issues, you can kind of preemptively address them before they get to a place where students and you and the team are uncomfortable. Okay, Ashley?
All right. So we do things somewhat similar, but also a little bit different. And I will say the reason why my strategy is just a tad different is I teach We the People as a standalone elective. So the majority of the students that come to be involved in the competitive aspect of We the People in my building are students I have had in class before. So a lot of the things that Megan asked on her questionnaire are things I already know about students. Like I already have an idea about like their writing ability and if they speak and things like that. Now, there's always surprises. You know, I had a student take We the People once, and when I had her the year before, the only time she ever verbalized a word to me was saying yes when I asked if she was present on the first day. And I was like, well, this is going to be bad, but she was phenomenal. So there are certain things that you don't always know about kids. I will add one addendum to, I still do the little survey that Megan was talking about at the beginning of the year as well. The other thing I asked, which seems like a really personal question to ask students that you maybe not want to know the answer to, but I want to know if they're dating anyone in the class, because I had a year where I didn't know that. I put 2 people that were dating in a group and they broke up, and it was an unmitigated disaster for the rest of the year because, like Megan said, my teams are generally final. That year they couldn't be because we had to make amends for that. But just, you know, it seems like a weird thing that you would never want to know about your students, but it is really helpful. I don't know if this happens in middle school too. I don't know when kids date. It's a whole new world here, but I definitely asked them that in high school. Um, so the other thing I do with my students is I have them create a like a wish list of units. I give them previous questions, and Emily's going to talk later in this session about where you can access all of the previous hearing questions so they can see the types of questions that are asked in each unit. To give them a feel for their interests. Because like Megan said, in the competitive world, they're in these groups from, in my case, like mid-September all the way through April and May as well. So we want them to be comfortable. We want them to enjoy the experience, because if they're not comfortable and confident, they're not going to enjoy the experience. And that's the complete opposite of what we want. I'm doing something new this year, which I will share in session 3 as well. Once I figure out how to share from a Google form, I'll have to ask Megan that. I'm giving a little constitutional knowledge quiz to help me guide my decision making with assigning units. So I basically went through the We the People curriculum and I picked 5 questions from each unit, and I'm just going to have them do it on a Google form and just do it cold. Like I don't want them to study. It's going to freak them out. But I just want them to take it cold based on their prior knowledge, just to get an idea of maybe what particular area they might be strongest in content wise, and then go from there. I have always picked the units, meaning I have always assigned the students. And then I usually, it really depends on the year. I've kind of gone back and forth, but I generally err towards I choose the students in the groups, and then we kind of democratically choose the units. So for example, everybody wants 5 or 6. They're like the most popular units because it's Bill of Rights and future challenges, and they get to debate the current issues, and that's what they want to do. And then unit 1, you're like on your hands and knees begging someone to do it because it's old stuff, you know? So we always have, but we have a democratic way of choosing units unless there's one that I know for a fact that I've purposefully put those students together to be in a particular unit. And then I'm just like, hey, you're that unit. And they seem to respond to that really well. They don't know how it works any other way. So they're like, oh, this is how it goes. So just kind of, and the more you work with the program and the more you familiarize yourself with the units and the skills and things like that, you're going to get better. Like Megan said, the first year you pick your units and a month later you're like, what was I thinking? So the other thing I will tell you is don't be afraid to make changes. You can't make changes once, at least if you're at once you're at the competitive level. Once you submit a roster for a competition, you're locked, but you can make changes. So like let's say you set the units and our regional competition is in November. We end up winning, but I notice like there's one unit that's just way off. Like something's not right. We need to make changes. You can make changes before you submit a roster for the next round of competition. It's just once those are submitted, you're locked. So you can make those changes. I have only ever had to do that once, and I'm really glad I did because it made a world of difference. So that's something you can do too. Let me think what else. The other thing I would say, when you're choosing these unit teams, there was a question in the chat about, well, if once you assign them to a unit, how do you ensure that they're getting the information from the other units as well? So something I started last year that ended up being really beneficial is I paired units together. So even though they were focused on the unit they were assigned, I strategically paired them with another unit that would be kind of like their partner unit because they can learn things from each other. So for example, one of the things that they're judged on is how well they can blend the historical with the current, no matter what unit you're using. So for example, my unit 1 and my unit 6 are a pair. So even though they're focusing on their individual 1 and 6, on days when I'm not asking them questions or practicing with them or doing whatever, they're working with each other. So like my unit 1 students write practice questions to ask my unit 6 questions. So they have to know the unit 6 content and to be able to write questions to ask them, and vice versa. So that's one of the ways you can hold students accountable for the other questions. The other thing I do is when we're actually practicing in the simulated congressional hearing, all my students aren't off doing other things. Like they're paying attention to the practice hearing that's taking place. Because the other thing is, and they always say this after every competition, they're like, oh my gosh, like unit 2 and unit 4 got asked the same questions. Yes, you just have to approach them differently. So it's important that they're paying attention and listening to all of that as they're working together. So that's just one of the ways you can make sure that they're getting a little bit of all the content.
Yeah, I agree. I do the same thing as Ashley. I pair them up, especially as we get closer to competition. One of the other things I have, and when we get to the calendar, when we show you like examples of our calendars, you can see it in mine at least. Before they start jumping into the actual competition questions, I give them a pretty detailed, like getting to know the unit outline assignment where they have to go through and read through the lessons in their outline, define key vocabulary, answer questions, and then we take time to share that. Like they put it in a shared Google folder for all of the other units. And then we'll actually go through and cross-reference some of the connections before they get to the competition questions. Excuse me, sorry, my voice is going. And then another thing that I do is for each round, like for each question before a round of competition, as they're competing in or participating in the simulated congressional hearing, each unit is required to give like a 1-page outline or info sheet that has like background, historical context, examples that they're providing that they share with the other units too. So by the end of preparation for state, not only does everyone have the information for their unit, but they also have these key unit guides for the other unit questions, which as someone who's merging AP and the We the People content together is a super helpful way to make sure that they're not just narrowly focused on like 1/5 or 1/6 of the content.
Right, and thank you. I want to make sure that like I can also raise a couple other things that you all might encounter depending on who your students are. So Ashley and Megan have kind of the benefit of having really well prepared high school seniors. But if you are in a teaching situation where you have a standard civics or standard government class and you are dealing with chronic absenteeism, a thing that you might want to be aware of is by the time you go and assign students to the different unit panels, you'll know, who has a hard time getting there. And so one thing you can do is try to kind of space those students out so that in the event that they are not present for either part of the preparation or unlikely to be present on the day that the students do the competition, that it doesn't significantly harm the rest of the student panel when you have only one student missing as opposed to 3 or 4 students on that panel missing. So that's a thing you just may need to be aware of depending on where your students are at. And other things you'll be aware of as you kind of proceed through your school year. Do you have a number of students who are English language learners who might benefit from being with other students in the group who are native speakers of the same language that can kind of help them and work with them a little bit more? Or if you are working with students integrated into your class who are, a few of them may be reading below grade level. So who in your group of students might be kind of the best teachers themselves to be able to work with students who might need a little bit more attention. So I just want to raise those couple of questions that do often come up in discussions about group work of any kind. All right, so we'll move on to then how we can further empower students with leadership roles and responsibilities.
So I'm the one who's ultimately creating the units, as I mentioned, with that student input. But once they're in their competition units, I really like to allow the students to determine who's going to be doing what. And so what I kind of it is a learning thing. Like through the first question that they do, they may actually step back by the end of question 1 and be like, oh, that was a mess. We need to rearrange how we assign things. So I'd like to give them that flexibility to self-appoint and rearrange the roles. What I will say to my students is that you're all in this group for a reason. You have interest or you have particular skills. And so I'd like them to even share with their unit members what skills they thought were strengths on that initial survey. Like, I feel like I'm a really strong writer. I feel like I'm really good at researching, but putting it all into words to like an opening statement is really tough for me. And so it might be that you have some people who are specifically assigned, like self-assigned, to be the heavy load researchers. They're the ones going out and doing a lot of the digging, but then communicating constantly with the people who might be the really strong writers on, okay, how do we take this and then turn it into a formal statement or an argumentative piece of writing? There are some that are really good at like picking out certain types of information. I have students who might really be interested and keep up with current events a lot. So they're the ones following all the news organizations on social media and reporting back to their group about something like that. So there's a lot of different roles they can take in that. I also like to have one that's like the chief organizer, who's going to be maintaining the files in the Google folder, who's going to be the one to like submit those files to me when it's time to review them, who's going to make sure that the unit knows like when their practice hearings are or something like that. But because I teach seniors especially, I feel like they kind of have a sense of what they might be able to contribute in which ways. But there are some years where I have to actually intervene and say, okay, what is your contribution going to be? And how do you explain that to your students? So don't be wary of stepping in when necessary to do that, especially like I'm doing this same program with my on-level government students this year, and some of them need more direction. Like some of them need to be told, you are writing today. You are the researcher for this. So if you feel like you need to assign those roles, definitely go for it.
And I'll just add a little bit to what Megan said. So I have similar roles. The other thing that I do a lot of is the only role that I assign is I assign what I call the unit leader. So each of my 6 units has a single student that when I'm looking for something or if I'm expecting something, I'm going to them. I don't want to have to contact the entire class of 27 students. I want to contact 6 students. So if there's something missing, if somebody isn't, now, obviously, things like when a student isn't pulling their weight necessarily within the unit, they need to come to me with that. But I also kind of empower with a little speech I give to the whole class that these unit leaders are kind of like my pseudo people, like they're the ones that are guiding everything. I also have another role in my room that so students are only allowed to participate in the competitive part of the competition for 1 year. So I do this program predominantly with juniors. So at the end of their junior year, I choose 3 of the juniors to optionally be in the course in kind of what we call a peer tutor. They get student service learning hours in the course during their senior year. And I call them my student coaches. So basically, anything they say is what I would say is essentially how it goes, because I do like a little training with them the few days before school goes back, and they know my expectations and what the units should be doing and things like that, and how to assist them because they had student coaches do the same for them when they were juniors. So I have that little role. The other thing I rely heavily on, and this is totally, I'll just put a caveat in, this is totally based on your district or school policies regarding how you communicate with students. We do use Remind, but last year I switched for my We the People team to GroupMe. And I have a GroupMe for each unit, and I am in that group text. The benefit of that is a couple of things. One, every single person in the group sees every other message. So like if Johnny texts, I don't understand bullet 1, everybody in the unit sees that, and so do I. My reason for doing that was they will create their own group chats anyways. And this way I'm in it. So it can kind of help mitigate any maybe issues that might bubble up. That's not to say they probably have their own group chat to talk about me in, and that's fine. But I found it really helpful, especially because a lot of their writing and research happens outside of class. So when they're working on things and they need a quick question answered, they can send it to this group chat. And if one of the other students can't or doesn't reply, then I can always reply there. And help them with that as well. The other thing that I do, and I don't know, this is probably more of an in-depth session 3 question, but there's 3 parts to every We the People question. So everybody in the unit has a role to play within each part of that We the People question. And that's something I let them figure out unless it's something that I know is going to be really beneficial. So for example, Unit 1 is very historical. So if I have any students that have already taken world history, or they've already taken like if I have anybody in Unit 5 that's already taken our constitutional law class, I encourage them not only towards those units, but also towards parts of the question that are going to lend themselves to skills and content that they've already learned.
Excellent. And I also want to make sure that for the sake of the recording, we address one of the questions in the chat, which has to do with what do you do when you have a very, very small class? So we've been talking here about, panels of minimum 3 students for each of the 6 units. So, do the quick math, that would mean you would need at least 18 students to fill out each of those panels. So if you have a class smaller than 18, one thing that you'll need to consider is if you're pursuing an organized competition, you will need to have enough students in all 6 panels. So some students are going to need to double up. And how you choose which students double up, that'll kind of be up to you. It will probably be the students who are able to shoulder that little bit of extra work. But Megan pointed out that when you strategize which units are you're going to have a student double, it can be beneficial to pair up units that make sense content-wise. So 1 and 6, 3 and 4, 2 and 5, things like that, or 3 and 5, I'm sorry. So it might make sense to think about it in those terms. If you are doing an in-school or in-class competition of your own design, I think it's just really important to remember that you do not have to do an in-school where you cover all 6 units of material. you can do an in-school or in-class competition with just a few select units. So if you're just looking to have the students experience the simulated congressional hearing, you can control, there are 14 kids in my class, 15 kids in my class. We're just going to cover units 1 through 4 or 1 through 5. That's totally fine. So that freedom and flexibility is there for you if that is what you want to do. So I wanted to make sure we captured that. Great questions, though. So thank you so much, and certainly keep the questions coming. Right. Study plans and timelines.
Yay. Okay. So one of the things, and we're going to share kind of our own individual thing with this too, just so you can get some different perspectives, because the one thing you're probably going is like, wow, this is a lot. There's so many options. And that's the beauty and the curse of this. There is no right path. There is no prescribed way that if you follow every single one of these things, the kids are going to love it and you're going to win everything. So it's just a matter of doing what's best for you and doing what's best for your individual students. So we're just trying to give you kind of what we've done in the past, and you should feel free, as we all should, to modify and adjust however you see fit. So as truly wonderful teachers that we all are, we begin with the end in mind. Do we sound like a PD session yet? So the best thing is you need to get in touch with whoever is in charge of your district or your state competition, whatever your competition is going to be, or if you're going to do an in-school, or if you're planning like an in your classroom kind of thing, figure out what date that's going to be. And then you're going to work backwards from that in terms of how much time you're going to need to prepare. It also depends on if you have students every day. Do you see them every other day? If you, do you see them every third day? There's some wild schedules out there. So those kinds of things. And then ultimately, you can't be with every group at every minute, every time you have them. So you've got to have a plan for what the other kids are going to be doing. Because we all know downtime equals the devil's at work when it comes to students. So especially high school students, and if you're a middle school teacher, you deserve all the credit in the world. I love that meme of like elementary, high school, and then the middle school teacher is like a Spartan man, like just like fighting all the demons, because you guys are rock stars. But so think about it. So in my classroom, we have a unit day and a practice day. So we've got, if it's a practice day, that means your unit is engaged in a practice simulated congressional hearing, either with me or with one of my student coaches, or with a combination, or with somebody from the outside on Zoom. Whatever it is, they're basically delivering their statement and they're answering questions from practice questions and practice judges. If that's a practice day. If it's a unit day for them, that's something where or a work day. That means they're not necessarily going to have direct instruction from me or another adult or a peer. They're going to need to, this is where the roles that we just talked about comes into play. This is where they're researching. This is where they're going back over the questions that were asked the day before or the last practice sessions that they might not have gotten correct, or maybe that they didn't have enough constitutional application, or they didn't have any evidence to support their opinions. This is the day where they're kind of taking it on themselves to better themselves. This is also an opportunity for them to do their unit pairings that we were talking about. Maybe they're going to organize their own little practice session. Maybe their statement, like my unit 2 last year, the first time they read it, it was 12 and a half minutes long. It's only allowed to be 4 minutes long. So that's where they're doing editing and things like that. And that's something I'll share in session 3, because I'm still developing that for this year, but kind of have in mind, like, what are your expectations for students when they're with you or when they're actually engaged in a practice hearing versus when they're kind of on their own to do their own research? Because if you don't have a set plan for, even if it's just like an option list, like these are all the things you could be doing, they're going to do anything and everything else. Megan, you're up.
Yeah. So one of the things about designating work days, if you see this slide there and going off of what Ashley said, is that I will give my students, like, we break up our calendars question by question. So we spend 3 to 4 weeks like leading up to state on question 1, then question 2. So what I really try to emphasize, especially in the early like research days, is that I kind of guide their research for them. So I will say on like your first research day, all you need to do is go on, all I want you to use is the Constitution and your textbook. Go back through, look at the lessons that correlate, look at the Constitution, because those are really solid foundations to base everything else on. It also helps students do a bit of like a triage situation where, as they're pulling information that they already know from the text, from the Constitution, they can see which parts of those 3-part questions that they may need to go beyond those resources to help them with. And then the like next couple of days, I will actually go through, and I have a classroom library of books that I've accumulated over the years, and I pull books for them for each unit, like 2 or 3 that I have, if I have access to them, and say, okay, now I want you to go to the books first, like second, look through there, kind of look through the index, see what some of the scholars are saying about this, or what additional background information you can pull or examples, something like that. And it's really just because as I've gotten farther into this, and you all know this as well, students will just automatically jump to Googling things. And I want them to really feel like a scholar here and see what an academic research process looks like. And then from there, I provide them, which is another resource you'll have access to in our third session. I have a document where I have various digital resources that my students have found successful in the past. And I even organize them by like constitutional interpretations, Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, Supreme Court cases, things like that, historical primary sources or whatever, so that then they can use those to start. And then I'm like, if you need something else, now go find it on your own, at least for the first couple of times, just to make sure that they're doing it in an authentic and academically honest way. But what I think is fascinating is as we get further into the process for each question, they will start saying, okay, well, we've already turned in a draft. We need to make our edits, but now we need to go time it, or we need to go out into the hallway to rehearse it or work on our practice follow-up questions. And so you want to make sure that as you're going through the process, you're at least, like Ashley said, giving them a goal for that day. Like by the end of the day, you should each have like 2 or 3 new examples or something like that. And then what I do is, because there are 6 units in my class at all time, I am jumping from unit to unit, checking in and getting verbal confirmation, asking them what they need for the next class. I might not spend time with all 6 units on every single day. I have 50-minute periods, 6 units, but I can go through and say, okay, who needs me right now? And I address those immediate needs first. Then I check in with the other units who maybe seem like they're on track. So I just think it's really important to be conscious. And as much as they are constitutional scholars and becoming experts, they're still middle school or high school students. So they're going to need that guidance and those prompts to stay on task.
Yep. And I would add further, if you, particularly in middle school, if you want to give them, specific deadlines for, I need to see your first draft on this day, I need to see your second draft on this day, whatever it is that's going to kind of keep them guided, all the better. And I also then just want to reiterate kind of what Ashley and Megan have said before, which is, depending on which avenue of competition you're choosing to pursue, that can dictate how much or how little time you give students to do this project. If you are working towards an in-school or in-class situation, in theory, you could give the students this assignment 3 weeks before you have the event. You could do it with 2 weeks before you have the event. It's going to be real tight. The deadlines are going to be, pretty fast and furious, but you can, make it an accordion, I guess, with as much or as little time as you're choosing to give the students to prepare for whatever it is that's coming. the end result, obviously, the students will be best prepared if they have more of a runway, but this can work with however you need it to work.
I will also say, and I totally forgot to say this, like if you are working to an in-school hearing, or especially at the competition level, I always take the week or two before the competition. And that's when I say, like 2 weeks before competition, all of your final drafts need to be submitted. And then I have dedicated practice days. So then in that week or two leading up to the event, we're not focusing on frantically editing and revising. We're just revising, or like refining and growing in our confidence with it. And so if you don't have that much time, even giving them a day or two before the in-class hearing or the competition to go through and read the first question they wrote so they don't forget what it says, is really helpful too.
All right, so Emily actually provided a excellent segue for us. So we're gonna put these links in the chat because we realize that you can't click the screen. So Megan and I are both gonna put the links to our calendars. So Megan's is her calendar leading up to states, right? Yes. And then mine is my calendar from all of last year. Just so you can kind of, and this is the calendar we provide to our students, just so you can kind of see like our pacing and our thought process. So I do things a little bit chunked at the beginning. So we'll talk about this more too, but when the center puts out questions, they put out state hearing questions, and there's 3 of them. And depending on your state and your district depends on how those questions are used in competition. So in my state, we use question 1 for the district, and we use questions 2 and 3 for the state competition, but we don't know whether they're going to ask question 2 or 3 until we're in front of the judges. So we have to be prepared for both. Unfortunately, our competitions are very close together. We have districts like mid-November, and then states is like the first or second week of January, plus winter break is in there. So when you notice my calendar, my students actually write responses to all 3 questions from the get-go, because there's not enough time for us to wait to after the district competition to write and prepare 2 more statements per unit and practice for the state competition. So my students always say, well, what if we don't win districts? And I always say, well, we don't talk like that in this room. But anyways, one day I'll have to figure that out. But until that happens, I'm not gonna worry about it. But so we actually start with all the writing and the research piece, and then we're solely practicing. And then if you win your state competition, the center is so nice and they give you 3 new questions per unit. And then at the national competition, there's 3 rounds of competition. So you do 1 each day, and then the 3rd round is for the top 10 or 12, whatever they decide. So you can kind of see how that works in our calendars. And we didn't want to like go page by page, day by day, but we just wanted to provide you a little bit of like, I guess, a pacing guide of how we work things out. And you can just see how we do it differently.
Awesome. Yeah. And from my perspective, our state's a little bit different than where Ashley is teaching in Maryland. Kentucky's program is smaller. We had a ton of schools when I initially started teaching, participating, and then especially with COVID, we're kind of in a rebuilding thing. So there aren't any other schools in my congressional district that actually do this competition. So I'm not kind of constrained by having a district competition before the state, which is why I'm broken down into a little bit different of a schedule. I usually spend the first semester, so you can see here that I don't have anything scheduled in August, September, or October. My first quarter is what I like to call Constitution Bootcamp, which is where we're covering the big ideas of any government course together. We're practicing those hearings, a lot of small group and whole group conversations, but I hop like I'll do a few lessons from unit 1, then we'll connect it to unit 4, then I go, or 2, then I go to 4, then back to 3 and 5, and then interweave 6 in between. So they get a taste and understanding of all 6 units. And then it's like this, I was a little late this past year and getting those groups out. Usually I like to have the groups ready by beginning of October. It wasn't until mid-October for a lot of different like scheduling conflict reasons. So each time, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to it, I have my students work with breaking down the questions. And then you can see I have those designated research days that I will tell them, like I mentioned before, here's what I want you to focus on. And then in my copy of the calendar, the highlighted things are like the big due dates of when they have to submit things. So you'll see that they're turning in at least 2 drafts of every opening statement within the initial question process. I also do something called roundtable review, which is peer editing, where the whole class reviews each of the unit's opening statements, makes recommendations for improvement, additional evidence, things like that. They really get into that. And then I have a hearing at the end of each question. And then we start with day 2. At our state competition for the past few years, because we are a growing program and have a lot of new schools entering, we choose to only prepare 2 questions for state to make it more manageable for those new classes and teachers to get their feet wet in the program and not feel like doing all 3 questions might be really overwhelming as they're kind of getting used to it themselves.
Thanks, Megan. And yeah, absolutely. That's it's very much a state by state decision. How many questions will be asked, which of the questions will be asked at the high school level. And then we mentioned in session 1, not every state has a middle school competition. If there is a middle school competition or a showcase, then the state coordinator will likely select a question probably out of the back of the level 2 book. So the Center for Civic Ed does not produce new questions for a state middle school competition. The questions that the center produces at the middle school level are strictly for the National Invitational, which takes place in May. So the state coordinator might choose one of the questions out of the back of level 2, or the state coordinators also have the freedom to be able to select old questions to use for this year's series of competitions. So it's very much a case-by-case basis. So please be in touch with your state coordinator. All right, and so for the second session this morning, we're going to shift over to enhancing learning experiences. But first, I want to make sure that we give some Q&A time to do with calendars, scheduling, team selection, everything we've covered in session 1. So please feel free to raise your hand if you want, or you can just take yourself off of mute. That's fine too. Or if you feel more comfortable in the chat, of course, you can post your question in the chat.
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
Thanks. So I am a middle school teacher in Idaho, and let's see. So I have always gone through and I've tried to just work my way through all of the lessons, all of the questions, and then in the end, I form them into their groups, and then we then start going back and writing their essays and doing the preparing for the congressional hearings. That's not what I'm hearing that you guys do, though. And I'm getting kind of burnt out and dry on it.
Fair enough. So yeah, a lot of my experience up until this point has only been in that dedicated We the People class that I teach. And generally those students that are signing up are like advanced AP level students, which is why I can kind of jump back and forth throughout the lessons and not go in a more linear fashion. My on-level students this year who are also doing the We the People program, they won't be in the competition element, but they are doing simulated congressional hearings. And with that, I'm taking the path that you kind of described, Amanda, right?
Oh no, you disappeared.
Oh no, am I here? Okay. So I am going through like unit, and we're going through most of the lessons. Some of them I'm skipping because they probably already got it in US history the year before. So I think there's also, some elements where you can take leeway on how much time you spend with each lesson based on your student knowledge, your interest, student interest. And for that, I am just doing, like I said, hearings at the end of each unit. So I am going in a more linear path. If you're getting a little burnt out on it, feel free to play around with it. You don't even necessarily have to do the lessons in order. It helps, but there have been years, and even this year, for my on-level students, and I have 100 students ranging from students who probably should be in an AP class down to students with really low reading levels, IEPs, 504s. And so I'm doing unit 1 and 2 and then jumping to 4, because 2 kind of talks about like the framing of the Constitution, and then 4 talks about the actual institutions of government. So for my students, it's easier to see that like as a chronology of here's what the framers thought, here's what they put in the Constitution, how has it worked over time. So I do think there's some flexibility to mix and match that might help you avoid that burnout as well. But I really, truly don't think there's one right way to do this program. Every teacher you have in the program is going to tell you something different. So I really think it's what you feel like. I get burnt out. I change things around every year just so I keep enjoying it. So I don't know if that helps at all, but
yeah, that's great. Thank you. I need my bag.
Any other questions that you all want to raise about?
Okay. Bye, Mom.
Bob, I see you've raised your hand. Go right ahead.
Hi. So I'm actually in high school right now. I run a student-led We the People club. And I was wondering, how do you deal with when you're running through your speeches, when you get to the part where you have to, where people have to prompt other people with follow-up questions just to get people ready? How do you really deal with that and making sure that people know their stuff?
So the easiest way to make sure, at least initially, to make sure they know the stuff is you create the follow-up questions with the answers. So it's almost like you give the students the follow-up questions, at least with some possible answers initially. That way, like if a student asks a question like, what's the president's role in foreign policy? And a student says, well, they don't have a role, or, obviously that's not the right answer. So, kind of giving them kind of some basic questions. And that's something Emily's going to share. Well, at least she's going to share some questions and things like that, some follow-up questions in session 3. But that's the easiest way, at least initially, until they get used to the material and things like that, is just kind of providing the question with an answer key, or at least a list of possible answers that way. And obviously nothing's going to be as good as the person, like whether it's you as the leader of the club, or an adult that's very an expert in that field or area, being able to off the cuff questions, but at least it's something and they're getting some practice with questions.
Yeah, I agree. I provide at the beginning, like once my students have started the research process for each question, I give them a list of follow-up questions that I've either recorded from previous competition years, or that I've used with students in the past as well, or that I pull from the textbook. And then I have the units prepare answers, like outline responses to it. And then I have them give it to me. And then I kind of filter through and make at least initial comments on, okay, you're missing this or you're missing that. And so then when they practice with their partner group, then the partner group has comments from me and from the students to know what they're looking for. Another thing that I do is, again, I cannot emphasize enough, and I know I sound like a broken record, but like go back to the Constitution. If nothing else, have the people in your club or the units go back and from the textbook and the Constitution and say, what are the key constitutional connections or principles here? If it's an immigration question and they're not talking about 14th Amendment, or if it's a question dealing with like this doctrine of incorporation and they're not talking about like certain cases that incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states, then that's where they need to go back to the fundamentals. And it's easy. My students self-regulate themselves. They like to check each other. They learn a lot from each other. So that's what I would recommend as well.
Amazing, thank you.
And I also want to raise Nicholas's question from the chat. 2 civics classes really mixed with varying levels of ability, just finished unit 1. Should I try to get through all the lessons first and then prep for the hearings, or assign the students to units now? So yeah, similar kind of questions. And and Nick says, my students were dying through unit 1. Yeah, the history and theory in unit 1 can be a real slog for some students, absolutely. Yeah, so there's, I think maybe Ashley and Megan have said this before, but like there isn't necessarily a cart before the horse situation here. You can engage folks early by letting the students know, hey, this is a thing we're going to work up to. We're going to, be in our different unit groups now. Start getting them to work with each other with some, potential some practice questions. And the textbook itself, as I think you all know, there are lots of the, what do you think questions that are prompting students to think in similar terms as the competition questions, just much shorter. So if you want to start to engage the students in small groups early, go for it. As I think Amanda pointed out, there is a certain danger to waiting until you cover all the material and then doing this as a final project, that the kids may not engage with you as much, but that there is no wrong way to do this. Ashley or Megan, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just say kind of what I said in the chat as well. Like, I like to mix it up because Nicholas is so right. Like, it's hard to get through as a political scientist brain. Getting through all that history stuff is brutal sometimes. But I like to mix it up. Like, I like to get them in their unit groups early, and then kind of either whether you're alternating days or alternating parts of classes where you teach a lesson here or a lesson there. That way you're still teaching and they're learning all, because honestly, it's beneficial for every unit to know the material of other units, because the judges are not just going to ask them questions that only pertain to the narrow focus of their unit. It's going to be just like this program is cross-curricular, it's also cross-unit something word that doesn't exist. So I like to balance it out between the two so that you have a little bit of hearing prep and you have a little bit of research, and maybe they're writing their statements a little bit this day, but then you want to like, okay, we need to talk about this idea. That way it kind of keeps them going and keeps that engagement.
Yeah, I agree with Ashley. Like I said, my first quarter is really like a quick dive into the key concepts that I have seen carried throughout the course. So like in unit 1, especially, we spend a lot of time on lesson 2 dealing with classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy, because if you go back and look at previous questions from every level of competition, like you will have a unit 5 civil liberties, civil rights, where it's talking about balancing individual liberties with like national security, which goes back to classical republicanism and natural rights. So over time, I've highlighted those things. I usually try to do at least a couple units from lesson 2 in that first quarter and so on. And then I'll do pull-out days. We'll do like a day, maybe 2 days of classes where I'm saying, okay, let's cover this. A lot of my pull-out days deal with unit 5, because I find that the like different court cases and amendments that are covered in Unit 5, I can cover in like a day with like one example, and then give them companion cases that they could further research if they think it's helpful. Yeah, that's kind of my.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead then and jump in on the enhancing learning experiences, but we will definitely have time for more questions when we break for asynchronous in a little bit. Okay, teaching argument essay writing. Go for it, ladies.
Okay. Ashley and I have already kind of covered this a little bit when we were talking about our calendars and how we structure things. But as I mentioned earlier, I take a lot of time to help students break down their questions. It's like anything else. You could write a beautiful response on a test, but if you're not directly addressing the prompt, then you're going to miss the mark, right? And it's the same exact way. So in session 3, one of the resources I'll be sharing, I actually have like, I hate to call them worksheets, but like graphic organizers to help them break down the 3 different parts of their question, identifying key vocabulary, identifying what they already know, but also what like initial questions do they have. And then I use those to meet and conference with the units on like day 2 of that question prep. I also let my students pick the order of the questions that they're going to answer. And so sometimes I'll have them break down all 2 or 3 questions before competition, and then identify the one that they're most terrified of. And I'm like, let's start with that. So we have the most time to revise and edit and grow in our knowledge, and kind of backwards design it from there. The other thing I would say is, as soon as you can in class, before you even get to the hearings, start having students take a stand, even if it's on silly things like, is a hot dog a sandwich? What's the best condiment or something like that? What's the best sport? Because then they can start thinking about, how do I clearly express my argument or my statement? And then what sort of necessary pieces of evidence do I need to back that up? That to me is a really key component. Those what do you think questions that are scattered throughout the lessons, like I live and die by those questions, because I'll have different groups be assigned different what do you think questions, and then say, you have 10 minutes to think about this, talk about this, take a stand, pull in some evidence, and then you have 3 minutes max to explain it to the class. And so from there, it gives them a less stressful environment, but they're still doing what will eventually be helpful in those simulated congressional hearings. So the more you can work that in, even before they're in the final units, even before they're looking at competition questions, the better.
Yeah, and I'll add to particularly the edit portion of Megan's slide here. I think particularly with middle school students, I've seen that it is very, very tempting for the student group to look at this multi-part question, and student 1 is going to take question 1, student 2 is going to take bullet point 1, student 3 is going to take bullet point 2, and they're all going to go off on their own, and they're going to answer the question, and they are going to jam together 5 or 6 paragraphs and call it a response. So as you all can easily see, and maybe this has happened to you, the end result is a statement that is very repetitive, because the students haven't taken the time to kind of break down the question as a whole, as opposed to the question in its component parts. So the editing portion is super important if that is what you're observing that the students are doing. So I'll put that out there for the middle school folks.
High school students do the exact same thing. We're really not that different between middle school.
Okay.
Let's be real.
Fair enough. Okay, so a word then on those of you who are doing this as part of advanced placement government. How do we make these 2 curricula be friends?
Okay, so since I am currently doing that, I know Ashley has experience as well in the past with this. So I know she's going to add some things. But the first thing I did when we decided to have all We the People students in my class also take the AP government exam at the end, because there are so many correlations, is I went through and for each lesson in We the People connected it to specific components of the AP US Government and Politics exam. And I share that correlation guide with my students. But what I will say, and I will share those correlation guides as well with you. I am in my first year, so some of you who might have more AP Gov experience, I'm sure there's a lot I can learn from you also. But I really don't think they're that disparate of areas. Like unit 1 of AP US Government and Politics is about like the foundations of government and the philosophies behind it. And a lot of the individual lessons within that unit talk about things that are covered in unit 1, 2, and 4 of the We the People text. Unit 1, especially talking about theories of government. 2, talking specifically about the creation of the Constitution, ratification debates, the Articles of Confederation. And then Unit 1 in AP Gov ends with a discussion of federalism that we see really emphasized in Unit 4 of the We the People text. So what I try to do very intentionally is focus on the We the People element, and then have AP pull out days once a week where I say, what did we learn in We the People? Okay, let's look at our curriculum and our course and exam description for the AP exam. How does this connect? What lessons and everything? So I'm really just showing them that one thing is not mutually exclusive from the other. On the same note, the skills that they're working on in We the People and AP Gov mesh perfectly. Critical analysis of primary sources, the required foundational documents in Supreme Court cases in the AP Gov exam, things like Federalist 10, Federalist 51, Brutus 1, the Declaration, the Constitution, and specific cases like Engel v. Vitale, Marbury versus Madison, and McCulloch v. Maryland are all things that are covered in the We the People curriculum as well. So what my students are finding is that a lot of those foundational documents in the AP curriculum are perfect primary sources to draw from when addressing the questions at the competition level. So it just reinforces to them that same kind of knowledge. The assessment component, FRQ 4 is a really good model and similar argument writing experience as a We the People opening response. So I often say, okay, I'll pull out an FRQ question from the AP Gov exam and say, what have we learned? How can we apply it? And then finally, just I think AP classes most of them tend to be a more solitary endeavor for students, because they're the individuals taking the test at the end, where We the People is so hyper focused on that collaborative nature that as I've been building the AP Gov curriculum and skills into my We the People class, students are starting to feel a little bit more confident taking risks because we're also doing it in a group dynamic. And so students who maybe were afraid of approaching a FRQ or a set of AP multiple, because they're practicing it in their We the People groups, they feel like there's a greater safety net before they try it on their own. And so I don't think, if this is what your school does, it can feel intimidating at first, but truly I think that they just really complement each other.
I will say that the only reason why it's not combined anymore in my school is because, let's just be frank, I was getting beat at the state competitions and I wanted more time to prep for competition, and that's why I moved it out. That's frankly why I did it. But I will tell you that I won't say that my AP scores suffer by not having We the People as part of my AP government course anymore. I teach AP government to 10th graders, but my AP scores were higher than they are now when I was doing We the People as part of the AP government curriculum. So it seems like Megan said, it will seem like a lot, but everything you're doing for We the People will is knowledge and content and skills they need for the AP exam. So don't feel, or dual enrollment, because my class is also dual enrollment now. If you have dual enrollment in your building, they're gonna do better by doing this program. All right. So for this one, we just wanted to go over a couple of things before we be quiet and let you guys do some things on your own. But one of the things that's really important to this program, one of the key elements of this program is fostering civil discourse. We want our students to do what our public officials somehow have difficulty doing these days. And we want to teach our students how to do that in an effective way. So that's a key element of this program. And if you're going to do that, you have to build trust. And we can't do that alone. So how do we build that trust in the classroom? First of all, we teach communication skills. At the end of the day, there is a public speaking element to this. There is a collaborative element to this. There is teamwork to this. There is respect of differing opinions and perspectives to this. So when you have this later, you'll be able to click this link really easily. There you go. There's all the resources coming through in the chat for you. But these are some great ways to actually teach communication skills because whether they're middle school or high school, the thing they know how to do best is this, and that's about it. So when it comes to actually writing something down or having a conversation with someone, you should see their faces when I tell them to call someone. They are looking at me like I've got 5 heads. So fostering those skills that with the advent of technology in their world has changed a little bit. Parents, people in your community, people in your building, people in your district, when people don't know what this program is about, they're going to be reluctant. They're going to say, that sounds like a lot of work, or I don't have time. Before you ask them to do anything, tell them, come in and watch this. Once they see it, I have never had a person tell me no to doing something for my program once they've seen it. So they will be sold once they see it, especially parents. Like they'll be like, what are you doing in school? What are you talking about? And then they come in, they're like, holy moly, I can't believe you can do that. And when it starts trickling home to the dinner table, that's when you know you've got them. So definitely include those parents. And then feedback. I change things every year based on my own reflection and feedback, but have your students give feedback to each other. Have them give self-reflection. During the next session, we're going to share the scoring rubric with you and how the students are actually judged at the competitive level. Have them use that when they're asking each other questions like, did you do this? Where do you need to improve? Doing all of those things not only fosters that discourse, but it also builds those communication skills and builds that trust, not just between you and the students, but between students to students as well.
Absolutely, yes. And, some of it just has to do with reflecting on group work. If students are not already doing a lot of that, then one element of their reflection could simply be, how did things go with this project? How did things break down? How might things go differently next time? Just to kind of think through the process, not just the content with the students.
One final thing with parent involvement is that now that I've been doing this is my 16th year at the same school in this program. Parents talk to other parents. And so when it comes to building a program, like they're gonna come home if they see what's happening in your classroom and remark to their students how impressive it is, but they're gonna tell other parents too. My program has only grown over time because of parent word of mouth. Like they will tell parents with younger students, the number of parents I'm like, well, so-and-so in the community said their kid loved this and got so much out of it. We want our students to do it too. It's also where you start, and I'm sure Ashley has seen this too. You see like the legacy families coming in, where once the eldest kid does the program, then all of the others are required to do it as well. So from a stability and ongoing like movement in your school, parents are your best resources.
And the legacy, that definitely happens. The siblings are a good choice too. I have a couple trios, and the middle child chose not to do it, and they got a lot of flack from older and younger. So.
All right, everybody. So we have reached our asynchronous time. Megan and Ashley and I are happy to stick around if you have other questions based on things that we talked about this morning. But our intention for your asynchronous work time was that we'd like you to take a look at your schedule, to start kind of breaking down when you think you might want to do competition, whether it's your own design competition or an organized one, and start thinking through the timeline, what might make sense for you. And then if and when you have questions as you're working your way through that, hop on back in and chat with us, and we'll help you kind of workshop that through on an individual level. So you're welcome to sign off and sign back in and enjoy lunch if you are on the East Coast. And we will, one way or another, we'll see you back here with our synchronous content at 1:30 Eastern time. So enjoy your break or hang out with us, one or the other. Thank you. I will, however, stop recording because this would be a long and weird thing to edit.
Just us staring at each other.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. I expect we'll have a few others joining us as they come back from their break time. But thank you all for sticking with us through the asynchronous time. And once again, if you all have any questions or anything that you would like to chat with us about regarding your planning or other specific questions, we will certainly be available for Q&A. But I do want to bring us back to our session on engaging experts and other resources, since there are a ton of great resources out in the world, and we would like to make sure that you are aware of how you can incorporate them into your competition preparation.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about, you don't need to be the only person asking your students questions. And we've talked about using students as peers, and we've talked about maybe like having a student coach. And it makes sense to easily grab people from in your building. But when students go to the competitive level, they're going to be greeted by judges that are lawyers, that are state congressmen, national congressmen, things like that. So if you have the ability to, at the very least, get your students exposed to and comfortable in front of people they don't know, so outside of your building and other adults in your community. So one of the best resources you're going to have for this is your state coordinator. And Emily put in the chat earlier, if you don't know who that is or how to access them, let her know and she can get you connected. Your state coordinator is responsible for putting together your state competition. So they likely already have a pool of judges that would be more than willing to work with your students. Your state bar association, unless you teach in my state, which is the only state in the country that whose bar association does not work with the We the People program, but most other states, Kentucky doesn't either. Great. So unless you're me or Megan, reach out to your state bar association. Make sure you let them know you're not trying to get money. You're just trying to get time and support for your students, and hopefully they will be amenable to that. Think about writing letters to local law offices in your area or local and state representatives. Also, your students are a great resource because a lot of times their parents or people that they know are involved in something related to We the People, whether it's the Constitution or just history, or they're just interested. I have this guy who runs a little local museum. My school actually happens to be adjacent to Antietam Battlefield, so we have a lot of Civil War history, and they love to just come in and talk to the kids. And sometimes it turns into a lot of them talking, but the kids still learn stuff, so that's good. think about like your central office staff, your district staff, your building admin, and then Megan's going to talk a little bit more specifically in a moment about alumni use. And don't forget, while there is a short list, one of the blessings of COVID is that we have technology, which is how we're allowed to or able to offer things like this to you guys from the comfort of your home, or if you're Amanda, from the car at the ball field. So you can have the benefit of bringing those people into your students virtually. So use that if you can, because a lot of times that's going to free up people's availability to help as well, if they don't have to come to you. I actually have a student that lives in California now that quote unquote comes in and helps my students each year virtually. So use that, one blessing, one of the short list of blessings that we have from COVID. And then Megan's going to talk a little bit more about using alumni here.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in as well that when we're talking about incorporating experts, there's a bunch of different ways these folks can work with you. So they certainly can serve as practice judges for students that they are somewhere in the middle of the writing process, and you feel like they're at the point where feedback from someone who is not you would be beneficial. You can host essentially practice sessions and bring the folks in and have them just, rather than give students any kind of score, just give the students feedback on the content of their presentation, things that they think maybe could be clarified better, instances where the students might be outright wrong. All of those things are possible. But that particular use of the expert is super duper helpful. The expert that can speak on a particular subject matter can be helpful, but it tends to be kind of narrow based on which of the students might be working with a question that has that relevance. So it's useful, but it tends to just be a little bit more narrow. But really, anytime that your students are able to engage with, outside experts, the better, because that will really get them into the frame of mind that it's not going to be you on the day that you're doing a competition. It's going to be somebody else from the outside, and they will oftentimes raise their presentation accordingly.
Awesome. So I am a huge supporter of using as many alumni as possible. My students are seniors by the time they get to We the People. And so there's not a lot of opportunities for them while they're in the school building to serve as student mentors. But by the time they finish the program in May and graduate, so many of them have felt like it was such an important experience that they want to try to give back in some way. I ask all of my students before they graduate to give me any contact information that they know is going to carry with them in the next step. So whether that's an email address, cell phone, some way that like a group me or whatever that we can communicate on social media, whatever, I will use whatever they want to use to get in contact with them. And so I put that into a giant database. I usually also put like what units they were in so I don't forget moving forward, because sometimes that's helpful. I always have alumni around this time, like reaching out to me, asking if state questions have been released yet, just because they want to look at it. And they inevitably then will send me feedback like, oh man, I remember when we did this question, we talked about this. Or I learned something in one of my college classes that I thought would be really helpful. And so sometimes they send those resources to me. Sometimes they're willing to like Zoom with current classes to talk through things that they're doing. And then that even goes beyond once they go to college. I have a lot of students who have gone to the military academies or enlisted that come in with a really unique experience and background when it comes with engaging every level of government. And so I just really, I bring in outside civic leaders as much as I can. Going back to Ashley's point, I am not from the community that I teach in, but it's very much a community where like you're born there, you stay there, you maybe go away to college, come back to raise your family there. And so I rely on a lot of the admin in my district who live in the community, who know people, to give me names or even to have them reach out to me. But what I've also found is by being in regular communication with a lot of my alumni, they also bring new people to the table. If they go to local universities and have like a poli-sci professor or a history professor, and that they're telling about the program, I send them an email to invite them to a practice or to speak to the class or whatever it might be. I just kind of going to Emily's point as well, about like specialists are great, but they do have a very narrow focus. I try to bring in people who have had experience with the program before, which is why I love that alumni thing. They're also a little bit more empathetic, I think, to students. And you know, they're a little bit more encouraging because they're like, okay, I've been there, I know what this is like. And so they can give tips beyond just like content, like, hey, it was in fact last year one of my units talked to an alumni who told them that during competition, the way that they communicated with each other, who was going to speak during the follow-up questions, is they would do like a really subtle hand movement on top of the desk to let them know. And they're like, oh, I would have never thought of that. And then all of the units picked up on it. And so, you know, like they're learning from those who have been through it before. The Center for Civic Education also has an alumni network that's always advertised on Center's social media. You can find more about it on the website as well. If you engage with the actual competition at any level, usually there's a really great plug or push for or encouragement for students to sign up for that. So, like I said, lean on who you know. This is also where parents become huge. Like parents who come in to see a hearing might be like, well, I'm not an attorney, but I have a good friend who is, or I have a college roommate who is. And so I don't have the program that I inherited and in the state that I'm in, I don't have like attorney coaches. I don't have like unit coaches. It's something that I've fostered over time. And even if they're new to the program, a lot of judges come back because they see how transformative it is. I would also say if you have a good relationship or know your superintendent, maybe reach out to them. Like our superintendent is very involved in like education issues with the state legislature. And so they are really close to local, like state legislative officers. And they often, like, instead of me reaching out to them, they will send the email. And I tend to get really good responses when the superintendent is like, hey, we have this program. Can you help? But yeah, alumni all the way. They are my bread and butter for support.
This is also totally true for 8th graders as well. So you're all going to be aware of whatever high schools your middle school is feeding into. Sometimes the high schools will have a Sister We the People program. Sometimes they don't. But a lot of times, if you have an 8th grade group that really loved the We the People experience, they are now high school students who are super excited to come back and help you. And, you know, sometimes they might be able to get service credit hours for essentially tutoring the younger students. But yeah, just as the other ladies have said here, the alums of the program, whether they're college, whether they're high school, whether they're beyond college, they're really eager to give back to the students that are currently going through the program. So, you know, certainly don't think that you're counted out because you're a middle school teacher. Yeah, you can definitely use alumni even as they're in high school.
Emily, I'm glad you brought that up because I probably should say that. So, our middle school, um, we call our program Building the Dynasty at Boonesboro, and so we actually, my team, when the middle school, so the middle school team's competition is like in between our competitions. So, and we're campus, so we just walk across the street, and my like Unit 6 students mentor their Unit 6 students. So even if they didn't do it, most of mine did it in 8th grade, but if they didn't, We just match the units up, and they walk over there, and they also go over there like on their like our students have like study hall periods and stuff. They go over there and help on their study hall periods. So if you're a middle school that's attached to a high school with a program, definitely reach out to that We the People teacher and see how you can connect with them.
Okay, so the construction of practice questions and finding other existing resources. This is big, or it sometimes can feel quite big. So, you have the students that are responding to the given We the People questions of the year, and you're wanting to run them through practice. But where are you picking the questions from? So there's a few things that you can start to do for yourself to help this process along from this year forward. It can be useful to start building up what is essentially a giant document of potential practice and follow-up kinds of questions. You all know the content of We the People spans the 6 units. The questions for competition, they're always going to match the content and the key themes of the different units. It does change year to year. However, we're always going to likely revisit similar topics every 2 to 3 years. So, for example, if you're looking at Unit 1 questions, if we don't have a question about the common good this year, we had one last year, or we had one the year before that. If you're in Unit 5, if we didn't have a question on voting rights this year, we either had it last year or the year before that. So there are similar themes that you see over and over again. So you can start to kind of build your own library of practice questions and follow-up questions based on what content you know will be out there. If you are drafting your own questions, you can always start with the what do you think's in the book, or the other bell ringer questions that are in the student edition of the book. The teacher edition has some additional questions you can pull from too. Anything that's open-ended really is a great jumping off point to start building that library of questions. I would also encourage you, as you're kind of thinking through these potential follow-up questions, to craft questions with different levels of complexity. So we're thinking about these questions not just that you can use, but when you bring in your outside guest to work with the students, and they might want a document that gives them some potential follow-up questions to ask the students. Some of those guests will be better than others at changing the complexity of their questions. And if you have a few written down that are maybe a little bit on the more basic side that can build up to questions that are more complex, that's great. It helps out that volunteer, especially if your volunteer is someone you've just borrowed from the admin side, who may or may not have any kind of content background knowledge. They can always look at these questions to have a nice jumping off point. But what I mean by the different levels of complexity, if there's a group of students that, you're really just trying to get the basic information down, you can always ask fairly easier questions like, okay, let's review what are the qualifications for someone to become president of the United States? Okay, and do we think that's appropriate? Do we think that should be changed? It's a fairly basic level question. And it can always work up to something more complex from there, but just kind of offering that spectrum. The incorporation of current events or past events. The reason I put tread lightly on this bullet point is that you will know as the teacher what current events or events of the past you have discussed in class. If you've discussed it in class, it's absolutely appropriate to ask the students a follow-up question based on that, because you know that they know. If you're providing questions to folks outside of your class, they don't know what questions you all have discussed in class about events that happened this week, this month. They don't know if you've done a deep dive into the Reconstruction era or the Civil Rights era. So those questions are good for you to include, but only if you know for sure that your students are going to cover that content. Otherwise, we don't want to put anyone, the students or your volunteers, in a position where they're asking things that the students have no possible way of knowing. That's not a good experience for anybody. So yeah, that's the reason I put tread lightly there. And of course, you will run across questions that date themselves. So in just a minute, we'll kind of show you the website where you can find previously used questions. So the Center for Civic Ed, when they draft the new state questions every year, some of them are very topical. And so some of the questions from a few years ago had to deal with the question of masterpiece cakes. And a while before that, it was, a different issue of the moment. So those are perfect examples of questions that if you were in class 4 or 5 years ago, you absolutely were discussing those issues. You may or may not be discussing those same issues now. So another useful thing to consider.
And sometimes the center asks a question about a current case on the docket, and they make the decision before you get to nationals, and you have to change your whole statement. That's really fun. That was the Timms v. Indiana case.
It's also happened. True story.
But that was the only time that ever happened that I remember. So no worries.
Hypothetical scenarios are also fine for practice questions. The thing I would always encourage folks to consider with hypotheticals, when I train judges at any level of competition, one of the first things we would try to remind them is your question has to be short, because the students, over the course of the follow-up period, the students really only have 6 minutes. And the students will be able to do better the more they can use that time to demonstrate what they know. If you ask a question that takes 2.5 minutes, number one, no one will be able to follow that question. And number two, the students won't have an opportunity to demonstrate anything. So hypotheticals are okay, but they need to be incredibly short. So if you are drafting practice questions that include some sort of hypothetical scenario, just make sure it is as quick and succinct as possible. So, hypothetical, what if we were to lower the voting age to 15? Go. Not a hypothetical scenario that takes 2.5 minutes. So those are just some pointers to put out there as you are thinking about practice questions. So next, we do want to talk about where you can start. You don't have to start from whole cloth. You can pull from existing questions, and we would love to show you where to find them. So Ashley put this link in the chat, and we're just going to take a quick look at it here as well. The Center for Civic Ed has not just this year's hearing questions, but past year's hearing questions as well. So if you were to look on our website, this will be updated very soon with the academic 23-24 state questions. But you'll see here that you can select previous high school national questions, previous middle school invitational questions, and then you can also select state and district questions for middle school. Those do not change. Those are the same questions that you would find in your textbook, but there's an online version. And then there's a similar one for elementary school. So again, the questions that are listed here, they're pulled out of the back of the teacher edition. But if you wanted to prepare a volunteer, this is where you might send them to say, okay, the students are going to be answering this particular question. Here's where you can see that as a PDF rather than trying to somehow take a picture of the document. But at least I'll point out here as well, for previous high school state questions, I mean, these go back to 2002. So there's a lot you can work with here. And you can pull the main question, you can pull the bullet points, any of that you can use as a practice question. The center is never going to ask verbatim the same questions during these different years, but the center will revisit similar content. So it is a-okay to pick from these documents for your practice purposes.
And while they're not verbatim, they are pretty darn close sometimes.
They're often very similar.
Very similar.
One of the things I do is I go back to the previous questions on that website and look at the bullet points for each of the questions. The bullet point questions I find are really good models of potential follow-up questions as well. So like if you're struggling to find models of good, like open-ended questions that allow the students to demonstrate what they know and aren't gotcha questions, the bullet points are really good for that.
And when we're going to share a library of resources with you for session 3. There's also a document. I will be the first to admit it's very old. It's about 20 years old, but it was put together by a former high school We the People Nationals competitor. That's like 75 pages long. And it has all sorts of potential follow-up questions that you can use to practice with your students. Some of those questions are super dated, but there's a lot of ones that are perfectly fine for you to use. So we'll share that with you next time. All right, and so our final section for today is optimizing practice and feedback. So let's get into it.
All right. So if any of you are national board certified teachers, you should be very used to videotaping yourself. But first of all, I will tell you, students will hate this. Nobody wants to watch themselves on camera. No one wants to hear their voice on camera. But I'm telling you, I can't speak highly enough, especially when you're practicing, of recording the students in action and having them watch the video back. Because while things like hand gestures and body language and things like that aren't on the rubric, if you have a kid that every time they talk, they're putting their hand out here like this, it's going to be really distracting to the judges. Or like if you have a kid that has like a nervous tap of their leg and it shakes their entire body, those kinds of things. So, and it also helps them see like how they interact with each other. Like they might say, well, like, I know I talked 3 times. Well, and then they watch the 6 minutes back and they're like, oh, I only really talked once and I didn't really say anything. So I can't talk enough about how videotaping the practice sessions is helpful. Also, taping your competitions. If you have the ability, I used to do it myself and now I wrangled my husband into it. If you can have somebody tape your actual competition, there's a couple awesome reasons for that. One, parents will love that because you can share it with them for those that didn't get to attend. 2, it's a great reflection piece that you can do in class after competitions, especially if it's before another one for what they did well. And it's a great way to recruit students for next year's team to show them what actually happens. And it's a great beginning of the year activity with a new round of students to see what it looked like. And Megan, if you have anything to add to that.
Yep. I would second everything that Ashley said, and it is perfectly fine to videotape. That is never an issue.
Okay, so thinking about some methodologies for student preparation, or at least how you might be able to use the methodologies you already use to help students prepare for a simulated congressional hearing or level of competition. A lot of what's on this slide are things that we have touched on in the previous session, that we've touched on today, But just to go over it, the more that you can emphasize that element of civil discourse in their unit discussions, whole class discussions, their discussion with you, the more practice they have with that, the more confident they're going to be in front of judges that they don't know. And so a lot of this program, when it comes to preparing for like a showcase or a particular competition, it's just building up the confidence of the students so that when they are testifying, they're not a nervous wreck. They're going to, some stress and anxiety is good, but we don't want it to be the point where it's debilitating, right? So this is where the more practice we have, even on a super casual level, when they don't realize they're practicing it, is great. Same with collaboration. There isn't a day where my desk in my classroom teaching this curriculum isn't in some sort of pod or group. Almost everything that they can do is group based in terms of answering a question, presenting it out. They're allowed to back each other up if they're in the middle of a statement and they lose track of what they want to say. I let students jump in. I personally, in my competition class, don't give, I'm even like this in my on-level class as well. I don't give formal tests and quizzes. Everything they do is based on this growth mindset and based on that final performative aspect and their preparations leading up to it. And so for students who might not be your like top advanced students that might struggle traditionally in school, I think this program really helps because there's safety in numbers, and the more that they can collaborate, the more that confidence builds as well. Likewise, as many of you have talked about, or I'm sure looking at it and looking at the nature of the competition, this is very much rooted in the ideas of like project-based learning, student-directed learning, where the teacher is the facilitator. So the more of that work and responsibility that you give to the students, the greater the accountability is, and the buy-in often is better. Like if they know they have to be able to sit in front of even their classmates during a summative assessment, that's a hearing, and be able to contribute meaningfully during the opening and the follow-up, that is much greater motivation sometimes, I think, than like your standard test. So the more that we can put them in the leadership positions, the better. And then finally, like I've mentioned, I tell my kids that we're trying to be a better version of ourselves every single day when using this curriculum and we're participating in simulated congressional hearings. We look at what previous units have done. We'll look at nationals videos from the previous year, but not initially. Like I sometimes show my students first, like the first round of hearings that my students do from the previous year. Like, I don't need you to be perfect right away, but we want to be really strong by the state or by districts or by the showcase or by nationals. And so the more that you can emphasize that it's okay to grow and learn and revise and edit and get better each day, the more effective I think your practices will be. I don't know if Emily or Ashley have anything to add to that.
That was very well said. Thank you, Megan.
Okay, so Emily, you found some great picks for these slides, I'm telling you. Okay, so when it comes to feedback, so when in the competitive situation, once the students finish their 4-minute testimony and their 6-minute questioning, or 8 minutes, depends on what level, the judges are going to give them some immediate feedback. But I will tell you, the judges are there to tell them how great they did, all the things they did really well, which is awesome. That's what we want them to do. But it's our job in the practice to give them praise, but also constructive criticism for what they can do better, and areas to improve. And it depends on what kind of judges you have at different levels of competition. Like I know our state level judges will say, you know, here's all the things we love that you did, but if you were to move on, here's some things to consider. So, but the feedback, the verbal feedback that they get, verbal immediate feedback that they get from judges in the competitive setting is meant to be very like positive leaning and, encouraging to them so that they have a nice experience. That's ultimately one. The judges will always say, like, this is meant to be a conversation. This is not meant to be an inquisition. And the best hearings are exactly that. But make sure that you're giving students feedback, verbal and written. I use, and Megan mentioned it earlier too, we use Google Docs for all of our students' written work. That way we can easily comment back and forth. We can add links in the comments to things they should look at, or primary sources they might want to reference, or a current event they might want to throw in, things like that. So anything you can do to provide as much feedback as possible throughout the process, while also remembering to be positive about it, or at least, critically constructive, so that students still want to do it and they still want to be engaged, because ultimately, like, as much as in the competitive setting, obviously you want to win, but it's about the experience. And I've never had a student regret being part of the experience, and that's what we want for all students involved in the program.
Absolutely.
To add on to that, one of the things that I do is I require all of the other units to watch every practice hearing that we do. A, because it's a learning experience. B, because like Ashley mentioned earlier, they'll hear like the number of times at competition, a unit that's going like second or third will pull information that they just learned from what one of their classmates said in a previous hearing. Like, that is huge. And that's that collaboration and active engagement that we want. I also, during every practice hearing, give my students, as they observe each unit, a feedback form for each unit where they write down, and I look at the feedback forms first, and then they all go to the students, where they write down, like, here's one thing I learned from this unit that I'm going to bring to my unit. Here's one thing that I know of that I think could help this unit in the future. Maybe it's a piece of evidence. Maybe it's like, don't shake your legs so much. I had a student several years ago who didn't realize that whenever she was thinking about things, she rolled her eyes, and it looked really dismissive, but that's just how she thought. And so a lot of students are like, do you know you roll your eyes when you're like thinking about things? And she's like, oh God, no. And so we went back to the tape, and there it was. So she started to like be more conscious about like making eye contact. And then I also have them use the scoring rubric to score how they think the unit did in each of the competition areas. Their scores are based on what I give them, but I think sometimes it's helpful to see the variances. So like I even tell them, like, run the numbers. There are always STEM and math kids who are like pulling out their calculators, finding out the averages. Like, look at that and see collectively, where are your strong points? Where are your weak points? Let's focus on getting better in those weak points the next time around. So before the next hearing, they pull out those feedback forms from me, from their peers, and say, okay, have we improved in our constitutional principles? Are we going to make sure that everyone talks and follow up this time? How can we make sure that our examples are more targeted to what the question actually wants? So that is, and again, that's yet another resource that I'll share, but I think a really helpful thing. You could also do it digitally if your students have access to technology and make it a Google form. I just don't necessarily know if I trust seniors to have their laptop in front of them and not be doing other things. So the paper is a way to kind of keep the distractions to a minimum.
Yeah, that's such a good idea, Megan. And I have also seen that done with 8th grade as well. So allowing the students to remain engaged in the process and looking for both for criticism, but constructive criticism on what they can recommend for their classmates. All right. So I think we'll sort of sneak peek the next session, and then we'll take any outstanding questions that you all might have for today. So our next session is a little ways away. It's September 30th. And there was a reason we decided to do that, because we wanted you all to have the opportunity to put some of the things that we've been talking about into practice. And, for you all to have an opportunity to try some things. Maybe some things are working well, maybe some things they're not working well, but we'll be able to workshop with you more effectively if you've actually had time to put some of those things into play. Additionally, this coming week, we will have the academic year state questions coming out from CCE. I'll say for sure it'll be by the 31st. I don't know that it'll be much before the 31st, but the new questions will be out for high school students. And we will be rolling out a brand new scoring rubric. So the next time we meet, we will be using this year's state level questions and looking at the new rubric more closely so that you can look specifically at opportunities to say, okay, you as the teacher, how might you address this question with this scoring element in mind? So that will be a big part of what we do next session. We'll also be talking more about additional resources and tools. We've been mentioning a few times that we'll have a library of resources to share with you. We will also spend a good amount of time talking through how you set up and prepare for an in-school competition. So, for those of you who either don't have an opportunity for a state competition or you just want to do this at school, there are a number of check marks that you need to tick off the list before actually hosting one. So we'll spend quite a lot of time with that. And then we'll also talk about how we can continue to have a supportive network among teachers who are using We the People. So that's our sneak peek of session 3, and it also will require separate registration. So once again, if you didn't already do it, please make sure you register for session 3. And it will be a similar time to today. So it'll be a Saturday. We'll join up at 11, and it'll be a mix of synchronous work and asynchronous work. So with that, let me go ahead and pause the recording, and then we will take any outstanding questions that you all might still have.